Welcome to another episode of Abwazi Wine Buzz. Today's show and today's guest, you might know the country more for their sporting prowess, rugby, cricket, but it's their wines that we're going to talk about today, and they certainly are a powerhouse. But in order to understand the wines, you need to know about them, and that's called education. Today, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome our guest, Mark Davidson, who I must say I had the privilege and pleasure of being taught by him many years ago, but yet they are still fresh as a daisy in my mind. Welcome to the show, Mark, and lovely to have you here.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Great to see you. And yeah, I'm glad that it's still fresh in your mind. That's very, very encouraging.
It is indeed. It is indeed. And that's thanks to your immeasurably exciting, insightful lectures, which
Well, thank
I
you.
thoroughly enjoyed.
Thank you.
Well, let's get straight into it, shall we?
Absolutely.
First of all, congratulations on your book, The Wines of Australia. So, audience, this is the book. Okay, it's written in such a way that Mark will tell you, and his name is right below here that you will see. But The Wines of Australia, how did it all begin? The concept of the book, Mark.
Yeah, well, I got approached, to be honest. A gentleman that I do, who's become a friend, actually, I've certainly known him for many years, but been involved in his conference. It's kind of one of the leading conferences and education conferences in the US for trade, and specifically sommeliers, called TechSom. And the gentleman's name is James Tidwell. He's a master sommelier. He got involved with what was then the Classic Wine Library. He got involved on the board there, and he's actually scheduled to write one of the books. And I guess they were just organizing writers and talking about books and series that they wanted to either rewrite or write from scratch. And he called me one day and said, "Hey, I think you should do this." And I said, "Well, I've never written a book before, but I mean, it sounds intriguing." Then I spoke with a couple other people, the publishers, and not the least of which was Sarah Jane Evans, who's a Master of Wine, who I'd met through when I was in the Master of Wine program, and threw in a proposal, said, "This is how I would like to write it." It didn't
No.
end up going that way, but so yeah, it came about that way. And so they lay out the fairly broad parameters about how it fits, because it's in a series, The Wines of. There's all sorts of other books. So that's kind of how it came about initially. Yeah.
Well, it's a great series, and I'm glad that you've joined the pantheon of the wine gods there, with this piece of work that you've done, which will stand
Thank
the
you.
test of time, Mark. Now,
Thank
as
you.
I mentioned, Australia is a vast country, but wine is a significant aspect of Australian economy, and they are a major player on the global market. Given that burden, knowing what you were going to write, what was the most challenging part of writing your book?
Uh, Two, personal and professional. The
Right.
professional challenge was the series itself. You have 90,000 to 100,000 words, period. That's it. It's no less, no more. It's got to fit into that parameter, meaning every book in that series is roughly the same size. So the recent book with my colleague David Way, he had 90,000 words just for Piedmont. So the challenge was I had to get all of Australia in that. New Zealand, even though that's a name I don't like mentioning. No, I'm joking. Um,
Why did they beat you at cricket, Mark?
Not cricket, it'd be rugby that's the
Oh,
annoying
yes.
piece of the puzzle. But that's the same size too. So in a way, that was to me a challenge in the beginning, which ended up being a benefit, and I can address that later, because I was
Sure.
glad in some ways, because it makes you trim out and just get down to the nuts and bolts of what was necessary. Now, it certainly could have been a bigger book. It could have been two books to cover it in more detail. But in a way, I'm really happy that, as frustrated as I might have been in the beginning, I was really happy, because you hold it up like this. This is not a coffee table book. This is a
No.
book you can pack and take to
Yes.
Australia with you when you go. And I'm very pleased about that. Um, the personal challenge was more, I hadn't written a book. So just getting started was, You're
Oh,
finding your
yes.
voice, as they say, and you've written books, so you understand what I'm talking about. Once I found my voice, it was great. Before I found my voice, I don't think my house had been quite so clean because I would find all sorts of reasons to. I'd sit down and go, "Wow, I better clean out the fridge," or make up some silly excuse. But once I got going, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, there are parts of writing a book which are not enjoyable,
Yeah,
as anyone will tell you, but when you find the flow and you write and there's something you go, that was good. And you go back and look at it a couple of days
yeah,
later, you go, actually, that's really good. Or you'll change it, not like it, but
right.
certainly it's a very satisfying feeling.
No, you're right. It's like the screech of fingernails when
Oh,
you get up in the morning. It's absolute discipline,
it is.
resolute. Whether it's there or not, you just have to be there.
Yeah.
So honestly, from one author to another, I can only say hearty congratulations to
Thank you
you.
so much.
It's not easy, and I had my original manuscript cut down by 50%. So I know that feeling. Now, there is the Australia's first families of wine, and
Correct.
and I've had the pleasure of meeting a few members from those 12 families. And to be a member, there is a criterion. Now, in your book, you have what is described as the invaluable list of 101 wines that illuminate Australian wine today. Why the number 101? And
That's a
what
good
was the
question.
basis for selecting those particular wines?
Well, there was a few things I did in the book that had nothing to do with the series, and it got a couple of good comments on it. And so but I didn't do it for any other reason than, um, well, I guess as my educator's sort of background and also the work I've been doing with Wine Australia, coming back to, because remember I was away from Australian wine and I
Oh,
came
yes.
back to it as a more recently with the role I have. But I think the 101 list came about because as I'm writing the book, it just constantly strikes me, and in my work, my everyday work, nobody really understands the length and breadth of Australia. Sometimes that's market driven because you're in a place where you can't get access to them, but even people who should know better say silly things about Australian wine and not realizing that, you know, you could say this about a few countries, certainly France and Italy, but if you were only stuck drinking Australian wines for the rest of your life and you had access to everything, you would never be bored. And that is my contention. And I stand by that because I think you can say that about France, you can say that about Italy. I don't think you can say that about every country. You might get bored in some countries. So as I'm writing, I was thinking there's so many elements to and categories within Australia that people don't understand. So I just started writing down, okay, hey, it's my book. I can say exactly what I want, and these are the wines that if and it's there's sort of tasting lists within the list as well.
Right.
It's if you taste it all, you'll go, wow, that's it. But in there, I think there's 8 or 9 Rieslings because there's more to. Not that you would be bored with good Clare Riesling or Eden Valley, but there's a lot of great Riesling from other parts of the country that are have been around. Like one of my favorite Rieslings, period, in Australia is not from Clare Valley. It's from a place called Henty.
Okay.
So I've got there's Rieslings because that gives you the length and breadth of Riesling, specifically Shiraz because people say Australian Shiraz, which is a term and I think is not even something you should be using anymore. But there's 12 wines in the Shiraz alone because that will
Hmm.
show you within a list the length and breadth of what I believe to be the full spectrum of Shiraz. So if you get your way all the way through that, it could have been 46 wines, it could have been 73. I got to the end and just tallied them up. As I was writing, I was going, that got to have that. No, you got to have this, got to have that. Got to the end, it was 100, and that annoyed me, so I added one. But I
I
kid
didn't
you
know you
not,
had that bit of Asian superstition in you there.
something, no, not quite a bit. Well, maybe hidden. I wasn't 100% sure, but yeah, honestly, I would have been happy if it was 63 wines you must try in Australia, but it was 100, and I'm like, no, come on, let's make it
Uh,
101.
I I think it was a great number because the 101, it resonates with the North American education system. So,
Yeah, I had a
well
lot of good.
done.
It's been a hook for people. They've gone and said, "Oh, that's kind of cool." And I'm well aware that you might not get access to these. You might have to be in Australia. Certainly, trying Wendouree is not the easiest thing on the planet to do, but it was more just the dream if you could try that. And there could be, oh, there's many of those ones I could have switched out. It could have been a couple of lists of
For sure.
101, but yeah, it worked out well. Worked out well.
Well,
I was
for
happy with
those
it.
that want to try the 100 and wine, then go for a little bit of a walkabout sometime, hey?
Totally, exactly. If that encourages people to jump on a plane and get down there, or spend more time while you're in Australia looking for
Sure.
those wines, then
Yeah.
all the better.
So, as I mentioned at the beginning of this interview, you are a remarkable individual.
Hmm.
You have, walked your ladder of success from studying, catering, and hotel administration to being the 2001 Sommelier of the Year that was awarded by the Vancouver International Wine Festival, and then a wine educator. And I can attest to your excellence in that field
Thank
and
you.
others. So, with all of this immense array and battery of experience, who is your target market for this book, and how would they benefit from reading it?
That's an excellent question. When I think probably part of the challenge that personally I had was like I was worried initially about other people who are writers reading it, da da da. Then I thought, I don't care. I'm not writing this book for other writers'
Yeah.
accolades. I'm not writing it for reviews. I'm writing it for someone that wants to understand Australian wine. So all the way through, it's like this is, here's the basics that you need to know about this region, and these are the wines within that region that are my picks that will illuminate that region and by extension Australian wine. So for me, it's not an intensely academic book. I didn't want it to be that way. There's enough interesting pieces in there that will make it sort of useful for someone that's academic, but you would have to dig more deeply on climate and soils and what have you if you wanted to go really deep. But it's about wow, it's a sort of a 10,000 foot, well, maybe a 5,000 foot view. It's a little bit closer when you jump in there and go, okay, I now have a look and feel of what Barossa is. I hope I've captured that for people, get a sense of the place, its history, and wow, I've actually now got a lovely list of wines, contemporary list of wines that
Yep.
I can go and source. And within there, to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the region and the producers, hey, look, these are the people you need to go to look for. And sometimes I mention their wine. Sometimes like, hey, look, source food. And sometimes like, hey, doesn't matter what, try anything from this producer, So I've been quite specific in some areas. But yeah, so I think it's for a wine enthusiast. I do believe it's a great book for people studying. You can get some quick reference notes in there. Um, but it's for anyone with a curiosity about wine in general, and then specifically pick up the book. You'll learn something. And I say that of all the series. I think the whole series is brilliant, which is now Académie du Vin. It's no longer, which is even more special to me because the first wine books I ever had were Stephen Spurrier's French Country and French Fine Wine. As I was a kid
Yeah.
basically, I was in my 20s, living and working in Toronto and playing around. I was picking up his books, and that was it. So now to be with it wasn't when I started the project, but after I took they came in and took over, I was like absolutely thrilled, and they've been fantastic to work with as well. So yeah, but so to answer your question a bit more briefly, I think it's for anyone that's keen and interested in learning about wine in general, but then to my mind, Australia is a significant piece of the learning curve for anyone that's interested in wine, and yeah, so it's for you.
Well, yeah, I think it is. I went through the book, I love the brief, precise, but concise writing on the history, how it was coming about. It's not fluffy. It's really to the point. And as a student, I think the worst thing that we want to do is sort of go through an enormous amount of information, and yet there's only that two or three sentences. So I think you've captured it
Well, thank you. Yeah.
immaculately well. And
Yeah, and there's some things, when you've done it, you look back and there's certainly a couple of things I'd like to change, a couple of things I wouldn't. But there's some things like, oh, I could have expanded on some of this here, and certainly not missed. There was a couple of producers where I hadn't had enough experience with them, or had some recent bad experiences. That was an interesting one that'll show up in the reprint of this. But someone I've known for a while went through a bad patch. I was like, I don't know, I'm not going to include them. Was back after the manuscript was given in. I was like, oops. The
right,
wines are back
right,
on form. So, but that's the
right.
beauty of our business, isn't it? The
Yeah.
beauty of wine is that it's not static. So, anyway,
No, it reflects life. So
for
I
sure.
think the way you've described it so eloquently, Mark, is some books are to be read whole, as Francis Bacon would say, Sir Francis. Others in part, while some need to be referred to. And yours has the balance and lovely mix of all.
Thank you.
Now let's carry on in that vein. what advice would you give to the readers, who buy your wonderful and impressive book in terms of how best to absorb the knowledge within the pages? So I'm a student. I've got an exam coming up. I have a verbal. I have to be able to pick it up from that one aspect. And then perhaps it could be someone who's doing some research, and they would refer to your book. What advice would you give them?
That's a good question. I think the advice would be maybe slightly different to for each person. For sure, I think anyone that's going to Australia should get it and take it with them because it is packable in the sense that it's not a coffee table book. I think,
Yeah, and
yeah,
just to remind the audience, here we are, there it is.
go out, buy it. Um,
So
yeah,
yeah,
I
how
think
would they absorb the information, like a student?
I think everyone's a little bit different in terms of how they absorb, but I think
Sure.
the sort of the weight for my mind is that I think that while I think there's some excellent reference points in the region, it's very straightforward. The regional explanation. Look, these
Yeah.
are the soils. This is the climate, the general, and I even talk about climate specifically, saying that as much as I I love talking about soil and climate within a region. The more you teach about it, the more you learn about it, the more you realize how sweeping and generalizing it can be globally, because it often depends very much on individual site climates. And so I'm guilty of doing very much the thing that I'm criticizing, which is, hey, in general, the climate here is so and so, but there's so many exceptions that prove a rule. For
Of
example,
course.
there's a famous Cabernet Sauvignon from Tasmania called Domaine A, and it's brilliant, it's wonderful. If you were left thinking that Tasmania is great for Cabernet, you're wrong. So that's exceptions that prove the rule. And there's a wonderful Riesling from Margaret River from Balloon Estate, but Margaret River is not a Riesling area, but there's
Oh,
exceptions. So I think all those sorts of things are important to remember. But when delving in there, I think it's really important to go and look at the producers when you've seen some of the basic information in the Barossa, because I think the producers themselves illuminate what's really special. So in some ways, look at the producers and look at the wines I'm recommending, and sometimes in some cases the styles. And I think that's, to my mind, captures the essence of the region.
yeah,
Well, maybe in a more personal way than when you're writing on the regions, it's like, here's what it is, blah blah blah, and then I come to life with the producers because I know them more.
of course.
It's the wine. It is called the wines of Australia. It's about
That's
the
right.
wines in the end. So
I think you've captured it then, and in the one sentence would sum it up. Everyone is different, but
yeah.
what's important is you have the information there for
Mhm.
them to go in and mine it. Now let's talk about you, Mark. Apart from writing books, what other wine activities, do you involve yourself in apart from
Oh, it's
information?
been my history has been all over the place because I started as a in the on trade, and I was in kitchens initially, and then took a wine course, and that was it. Wine was my primary focus, and I've never lost enthusiasm or
Mhm.
curiosity, and I think that's a cool thing. So prior to that, I was doing a multitude of different things. Now I'm very much focused on Australia, specifically Australia now. Um, so we do. I mean, in my work, I
Tell us
do
about
what
your
you.
work. What is
Yeah.
Wines of Australia education?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It's very much trade facing. Doesn't mean we don't do consumer things, but what you caught the tail end of on Thursday in Vancouver was our roadshow. One of our roadshows. We were in Houston the week, the beginning part of the week. We did a trade seminar and then a walk around tasting, and then there was a consumer tasting in the evening. In Vancouver, we didn't have the consumer tasting, so I led the master class at the beginning of the day in both cities, in some cases partnering with people in those cities just to sort of illuminate a particular subject. And so that's very much part of my work, is to engage with the trade, find the things that will open the door and get people engaged or keep Australia front of mind, because we have to remember, for people in the wine trade nowadays, there's so much good wine to look at. I mean, we don't live in this little vacuum of Australian wine, that's for sure, but there's a lot of good wine. So
Yeah.
my job, and one of the challenges of my job, is to what's relevant, what's exciting, and how am I going to get these people to come, because they've got 47 different invites per week in certain times of year to go
Yeah,
to various things. So
I know.
so I
Oftentimes I have to turn them down.
agreed. No, and we understand that. So, I try to make it as compelling as possible, say I can't turn this down.
Sure.
So,
Now,
sometimes we succeed, sometimes we don't.
now, Mark, you've been involved in the wine industry for over 30 years now.
Yep.
And since that time, a new drinking generation has risen.
Hmm.
They are being more influential, and some of them prefer this, non-alcoholic or low alcoholic. How does that affect, the Australian wine producers, not only yourself, but other producers?
Oh, yeah. Look, I don't even think it's just about Australia. I think it's a global issue that we've got
Yeah,
now, or because I think tastes are changing, things are changing. I feel like these things breathe in and out, and I'm not quite sure what the end game is. I think to address without going into too much detail about the people drinking low and drinking no, I have no issue. I mean, people
of
do what they
course.
want to
Yeah.
do. What I'm not a fan of is lack of transparency or even accuracy, because I think when it gets lumped in together, and I think this maybe requires some advocacy for wine, a shot of spirits, a beer, glass of wine, same thing. That's considered a measure of alcohol. And I look at that and I even put the spirits and beers out of it. When someone says, if you have a glass of wine per day, it's like, well, hang on a second. A glass of wine's not a glass of wine. You can have a commercially made wine. I was, giving this example, nothing wrong with Snoop Dogg's California Red, but there's 26 grams per liter of sugar in it. And the difference between that and another glass of red wine is quite significant. So we don't have ingredient labeling in the way that the average consumer can walk into a store, turn over and have a look and say, wow. And so the analogy for me is like, well, that's like saying it's like saying a piece of cheese is a piece of cheese. Well, there's Kraft singles, which we know is very much manufactured and heavily manufactured, versus a piece of artisan cheddar from somewhere. So
Yeah.
I wish there was a bit more transparency, and I do think ingredient labeling would be great. So we could go, hey, this. So I think that's a bit nerve-wracking for me because we're in the business. I think wine is very much part of a very healthy lifestyle, and there's many, many examples of that. That aside, I do think it's an interesting issue back to your original question,
Mm.
which is people are drinking less. They're drinking
Yeah.
or none at all. And so less but better I like. Less and towards none at all. Obviously, in our business, I don't like it. I think
That's
it's
not good for
nerve-wracking.
business, obviously. Yep.
So I feel like there needs to be still a little bit of an illumination that, when the world, I was talking to Laura Catena, who you may know from Argentina. We happened to be at
Yes.
Texom together, sitting through the same seminar. She's a doctor, and she was saying how it's funny because the World Health Organization saying no alcohol at any time ever is good for you. Another medical journal came out and said that actually that study was flawed, and they acknowledged it, but the World Health Organization has not. It's become, I think it was Lancet or something else, and she
Yeah.
said, "Look, that hasn't come out yet." So I think those alarmist things are not very helpful. But yeah, I do think the tendency for people to drink too much can be there, and
Of
it needs to
course.
be
I mean, it
monitored.
depends
So
on the individual.
yeah,
But staying on the same tack here, wine consumption has been dropping globally.
yep,
There's no question about this.
yep,
And this affects all wine producing countries.
yep.
Now, especially Australia, after the shattering effects of the China market, what happened a few years back. What are your thoughts, for what is the future for Australian wines now that it's opened up,
Oh,
all politics
it's
aside, just
Yeah, look,
pure
just to give
business.
you some simple numbers for the listeners, it was quite a devastating blow because China became a very big market for us. And so I think the tariffs were imposed, the
Correct.
excessive tariffs were imposed in 2020, 2019, 2020.
Mhm.
So just prior to that, so 10 years prior to that, just to give you perspective, we were selling about 40 million liters of wine, sorry, $45 million worth of wine to China that was being exported. 10,
Australian or US dollars?
let's call it Aussie dollars, call it
Aussie
Aussie
dollars.
dollars,
Okay.
same as Canadian.
Yeah.
So 45 million 10 years prior. Right before the tariffs, it was 100 million per month. So it was
Mm,
$1.2 billion worth of
gargantuan
sales.
growth, gargantuan.
Gargantuan, but that went and evaporated overnight because of the tariffs. Not completely. There was some bulk wine and what
Yeah,
have you,
of
but you
course.
could say as much as like about $1 billion worth of wine sales disappeared. So it was a massive struggle for people. And I think, I mean, if it's a lesson for anyone, not just Australia, you have to have a balanced export strategy. If you're putting all your eggs in one basket, guess what happens if the basket breaks?
Well, I
So
think that's an age-old proverb.
absolutely, yeah. And so I think it was a struggle, but we're coming through. China has opened up again, and things are on a massive increase. Yeah, I think 6,000% growth over the last however long, which is
Wow.
like stunning. We're up to, I think, I was just looking at a document we were sent, which I can now talk about, but I think year to date, oh no, so this year we're at yeah, 490 million now. So, and
Climbing,
that's,
climbing.
well, it's also backfilling the
Sure.
pipelines of wine.
Sure.
So we'll see what that looks like. And I think, I think people are going to be, you would hope people are cautious and still have a bit. So, I mean, it's a big, wonderful market for us, and it's very easy for Australians to get up in and out of China, more so than going to Europe or to the United States. So, yeah, I mean, that's a positive, but it certainly was a challenge. But I think it's made us realize that, as it is in many places, I mean, yeah, I'm going to be careful what I say here, but I do think there are some things that need to go away, as there are in some areas of the wine world in general. There are certain things and brands, possibly, and styles that maybe are not going to be as popular. So perhaps
Yeah,
certain areas, certain regions, certain styles might need to be a little bit less, a little bit more trimmed, because if there's no market for it, I mean, the market will sort
absolutely.
that out.
Yeah, the market will determine what they want. And,
Yeah.
I think what's really important too is, winemakers, of course, they want to have that originality. They want to have that characteristic of as the French would say, it's all in the soil and that. But realistically speaking, you have to prepare and perhaps produce wine for the market that it's aimed for, because the palate,
Yeah,
the
and it is
food,
the,
it's all very
yeah.
different.
And the segmentation's interesting because I talk about this a little bit in the book. I talk about the Shiraz conundrum, and that's a separate sort of issue just about Shiraz and how it's not as popular as it used to be. Yet it, in my mind, it's a heritage grape. It's, some of the best wines ever made in Australia have come from that variety. Yet right now, selling it's a little bit hard. You go, okay, what's the issue? And I think it's segmentation for sure. And you get people saying, oh, Yellowtail ruined the image of Australian wine. And I'm like, no, that's a simplistic assessment of a
That's
far more
right.
complex problem to my mind. And, I think it was the copycats. Yellowtail's success was massive, like one of the great wine stories
Yeah,
globally, never mind Australia. It was
it was.
required
Yeah.
reading at
Yep.
Harvard Business School for a period of time. And all the copycat brands came along. So the category of Australia, and you saw it in Vancouver, and I saw it in the US. It was a zoo of critter labels, and that was the image of Australia. The interesting thing is, and I say this to remind people of this, Casella, who owns the family that
Yes.
owns Yellowtail, they're still here. They're innovative. They're smart. They're still making fun wine. The rest of the copycats are gone.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's not like Sutter Home White Zinfandel ruined the image of California. I think where we've got some issues, and certainly with a variety of Shiraz, and I know that a lot of people agree with me when I ask this question. Some may disagree, but I think there's a price point, and we'll take it from Australia in that sort of $20 to $30 price point of really simplistic Shiraz that is just fruit and oak and nothing else. And I don't drink that. How can I expect other people to drink it or get excited about it? And I do think a bit of boredom and torpor has set in for that variety at that point. But then if you get around and try it, and I think you use that microscope or that lens of Shiraz through which to view the rest of Australia, I think, and you could talk about in other parts of the world. It's like, yeah, maybe there's some sort of styles of wine that need to be sort of tightened up a little bit. Maybe there's other varieties that might show in
Yeah.
those sorts of regions that are a bit more interesting, create some diversity. But I think sometimes boredom can set in, and I think the amount of Shiraz that was being sold globally, and the different ranges from cheap and cheerful supermarket to some of the greatest sort of red wines you'll ever try. Maybe there's not room for all of that anymore. But I don't know. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't
Yeah.
have
You're
the
right.
answer.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And talking about choices now, this is serious stuff now, Mark. You're having a three-course dinner with friends
Yes.
and you're hosting, Mark.
Yeah.
First course is shrimp and lobster salad.
Yeah.
Second course is steak and dessert. Steak and, of course, dessert. And the
Okay.
dessert is the sort of Milo Pavlova, which I think Australians really like, right?
They
Which
do. Well,
Australians
we like to
would you
claim,
pair and why?
okay, we like to claim pavlova as our own, but it came from New Zealand, which most people hate. But now the Milo pavlova has chocolate in it, so it's
Okay.
different. It's different from the
Okay.
regular. So
Shrimp
there's
and lobster salad.
ah so much. I think. for my mind, lobster, crab, and I have a pairing for crabs for Dungeness crab from Vancouver days, but I'm going to
Okay.
stick with it. I think a really high quality Chardonnay, for my mind, and I would probably get, I mean, there's any number of places I would love to just sort of head straight over to Margaret River. I would have a Margaret River Chardonnay with the lobster salad, lobster and shrimp, because I think the richness and sweetness of the of that lobster meat, especially if it's good quality and if it's butter poached lobster, even better.
Hmm.
But there's something about the beautiful sort of weight of Margaret River Chardonnay because there's an intensity of fruit, but with this spine of this lovely lime-like acidity in the very best examples, things like Lewin Estate Art Series or
Yep.
Vas Felix Heytesbury or any number of really good quality Aussie shards. I would that's if budget's no option
That sort of
or
hits
no.
you, right? Okay.
That was the first thing I would think of. It'd be to me, it's Margaret River Chardonnay, and Chardonnay is absolutely on fire in Australia right now, and has been for a good 10 to 15 years. There's so much good quality Chardonnay, and I'm a huge lover of Burgundy. It's where I cut my teeth. I just can't afford the great stuff anymore. It's just
Yeah.
going through
No,
the
I'm
roof.
going to
So it's
leave
like,
you to Australian wines, Mark. I'm going to confine you to Australian wines. Otherwise, we could be here, and I'd
be
love to
forever.
be here for forever. Now, how
Okay,
about
now
steak?
next, steak. I think I would definitely be looking at, I mean, I think it's either Cabernet or Shiraz, or frankly, a really good quality Cabernet Shiraz. So I'm going to actually lean in towards that, which is a wonderful blend. You've got this richness of the Shiraz fruit being sort of nicely cosseted inside the frame of the Cabernet. There's
Right.
any number of great ones. Penfold's been 389, but I'm going to stick with Yalumba Signature.
Your lumber signature.
My favorite wine from the Yalumba portfolio, red wine from the Yalumba portfolio. I think they've got wines made way more expensive, but they've been making that wine since the 60s, and it's a classic. And I would definitely have it with about 10 years of age for that. That seems to be the beautiful time. So right now, let's drink the 2014 Yalumba Signature,
Okay.
the
So
steak.
that so I will see if I can hunt a bottle down for that particular vintage. Now, how about the dessert?
Yeah, dessert's always a bit tricky for me because I tend to be one of contrast. I like dessert wine with cheese, but with the
Okay.
pavlova, because if it was the fruity pavlova, might have done something different. But I'm going to go to Rutherglen for a fortified wine for the muscat, a fortified muscat. I'm not going to go the too sweet. There's four levels to the muscat wine, so I'm going to pick something like I think I would do Chambers muscat. I would do the Grand Muscat, which has some age to it. I think it would go nicely with the sweetness obviously would match it, but the fact that there's some chocolate in that pavlova, I think that'll be beautiful. So it's a muscat. It's got the fruitiness to go with the fruit elements to the of the pavlova, and
Well,
then the chocolate piece.
that's one of my personal favorites, and I think I even recalled asking some people if there's any Rutherglen Muscat.
So it's magic, absolutely
Yeah,
magic. The legacy of all the fortified wines that we've produced historically in Australia. So it's fantastic. Yeah.
it is indeed. Now, talking about, now we've had a great dinner, and obviously we all become philosophical after some wine and food. What words of wisdom would you like to leave, future wine educators and those entering the Australian wine industry in the coming years to consider?
Uh, I think dealing with like sort of a two-part question. So I'm going to answer the second part first, which is people coming into that. I think there's never, and we can say this about many parts of the world right now, but there is literally never been a better time to experiment with Australian wine. I think it's always been a fun, accessible country, but the amount of changes that have happened in the last, say, 7 or 8 years, it almost seems more's happened in the last 7 to 8 years in Australia than the previous 20 or 30. I just think there's some emerging styles. I mean, anything and everything you could sort of want stylistically is coming out of Australia. I believe the classic wines have evolved. So, and some classic wines have become contemporary. Things like Hunter Semillon just tick
Yeah,
all the boxes for what people want now. So to my mind, it's the greatest time to go in and just explore. I might have said in the past about, oh, if you're trying 20 years ago, if you're trying Australian Pinot, yeah, try this producer that. Now it's just knock yourself out. I'm so confident about the overall quality is just to get out, explore, experiment, pick up a bottle, try different things. Don't stick with your normal choices. Always be, and I think Australia's a safe bet to
yeah.
experiment with.
Sure.
For educators, I think the lesson I learned, and I appreciate the comments you made about my sort of style. I think the mistake I made in the, if indeed there were any mistakes, I think when you get into wine education, you're so hell bent on it being about information delivery that the reality is that anyone can pick up a book and read the stuff. What you need to do, as I think, as a good educator, is that, I mean, it's a well-used term about edutainment. It has to be fun, it has to be accessible,
Oh,
but
yes.
it's about framing the subject matter and bringing that to life, because anyone can read all the academic pieces of it. Anyone can pick up something and pick up my book and read about it. It's about how do you pull those pieces of what sometimes seem like a complicated subject, make it, simplify it, and bring it to life for someone, so it makes them.
Yeah,
If
it's
I
going to
if I
be
have someone
fun.
that, yeah, it should be fun. If someone ends up I just want to go there now, then I've done my job, because in the end, that
Yeah,
is what you need to do. If you
yeah.
really want to understand why, you got to go there. I mean, teaching Burgundy the first time, I loved it because it was my passion. Teaching about Burgundy was a nightmare the first time. I got lost because it's so you had to figure it out. And I think this idea is it's less about I am delivering you this information. It's like, well, yes, I'm doing that, but I'm also trying to bring these subjects to life and making sure that what you talk about is 100%, and it doesn't always happen. The wines don't always behave, but I've just talked about this, therefore that should be reflected in the wine I'm trying to show you. So be very cautious with your wine selections. Make sure they reflect what you're talking about. Or if you say, oh, this is so and so, and like, that's not at all what he said. It doesn't taste anything like that. So that's the trick.
That indeed is the trick. And I think that many of our viewers, you and I present here, Mark, I think we often don't pay enough accolades to the wonderful people that taught us to be where we are today. And I know that you now belong to that pantheon, and for
Thank you.
generations to come,
Thank
they
you.
will
Thank you.
read your book, Wines of Australia,
Thank you.
which I must say I like the color, you know.
It was,
So
yeah.
for those out there, our audience, I would encourage you really go out, pick up this book, because I know the author personally. I've been taught by him. It was a real privilege, and it is truly an honor to have the opportunity to interview you on our Abwazi Wine Buzz, Mark. Thank you very much indeed.
Absolutely my pleasure. It was wonderful to see you and wonderful chatting with you.
Thanks, Mark. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching our video. And if you liked our video, please like, share, comment, subscribe to our channel.